Hello, everyone. I want to look at a game between Hikaru Nakamura and with the white pieces and Maxime-Vachier LaGrave with the black pieces. And this game is from today, June 10th, 2017. Let's get right into it without further ado. E4 by Nakamura, C5 by Vachier LaGrave. He is a known Sicilian specialist. And he plays his favorite Nadjorf here. Open Sicilian by Naka. Knight f6, knight c3, a6. So Vachier LaGrave is a specialist in this variation, and so he knows it in and out. The downside of being a specialist in a certain variation is that, of course, it is easier for your opponents to prepare something special for you. So yes, you know the ins and outs of the variation, but your opponents can pinpoint, where to attack in your repertoire. All right. This is the same problem that Peter Svidler faces in the Grunfeld. He's known across the world as a Grunfeld specialist, and therefore GMs will pinpoint and try to pick the most troublesome continuations for him, or even obscure sidelines, just to test his knowledge. So a6, knight off, and now we see bishop d3, which is not the most common move. Okay, the most popular move is still, actually, I was gonna say bishop g5. It's not the most popular move anymore. The most popular move now is bishop e3, probably for the last several years or so. Bishop e3, with these ideas, of course, of playing f3, then g4, h4, queen d2, castling queen side. h3 is another popular continuation. Bishop g5 also remains one of the great classical continuations. The quiet bishop e2. All right, old favorite of Karpov's way back when. And let's not forget about bishop to c4 also. So of course, each one of these moves, let me not forget to mention just the f3 is also continuation. But like I was about to say, all of these moves have little, their own little ideas attached to them. And sometimes, as amateurs, we often don't know the ideas. We just look at it as another move, or we just see like like the basic, like for instance, we'll look at this move and say, well, okay, bishop d3 is just supporting the e pawn, and we'll leave it at that. Not looking any deeper into the position. This line was played, I would say, at top levels, mostly by Judith Polgar with the white pieces. And this move is again, not a refutation of the knight off by any means. But instead of putting this bishop on e2 or c4, it goes to d3. And after e5, which is one of the normal continuations that we see a lot, which happens after the bishop goes to e2, after bishop e3, we even see the move e5. So let's talk about bishop d3 first. What this move does, of course, obviously it supports the e pawn along with this knight, all right, on c3. But one of the strategical ideas is that it leaves this diagonal open. So depending on what black does, sometimes the white queen will end up on f3 or even g4 at times, and is able to contribute to the growing pressure on black's queen side. So putting a bishop on e3 leaves that option open, as opposed to coming to bishop e2 where that option is not open. So you see that if you look at the games in the database, you'll see some games where the queen winds up getting into the fray because this is left open. Another strategical idea is often in these lines, for instance, bishop e2, e5, the knight often ends up on b3. Okay, by leaving the e2 square open after e5, this knight now has the option to come back to e2, all right, and participate in the fight against the king side. All right, so it can assume a little more aggressive role if white wants to play that way, as opposed to the knight being on b3. The knight can assume more, more of an attacking role, being closer to the black king side. Okay, so those are the main ideas behind this move, bishop d3. Yes, it adds support to the e pawn, but leaving the e square open, the e2 square open, and the d1 h5 diagonal uncluttered leaves white with some additional options to play in a more aggressive manner. All right. Now the downside of this move is that the bishop, being on d3, is behind a pawn, and it almost looks like a glorified pawn itself on d3. So sometimes this bishop doesn't have a lot of say in the position, but it's one of those things that, it's a give and take. So you're giving up some options to gain other options, and so that's some of the strategical ideas behind the move bishop d3. e5 by Vachier LaGrave. And as we see, Nakamura utilizes the e2 square. And so now this knight will be able to participate in future attacks on the king side if he wishes. Bishop e7. Castle. Castles. Now, it may be obvious to some, but I just want to make a brief mention for the newer players. This is a backward pawn here. And it is important for black at some time to be able to advance this pawn and liberate his position. Strategically, white wants to keep control over the d5 square, the square right in front of the weakened pawn. And we can see him pressing here with knight c3 and the pawn on e4. If white is able to maintain that situation and control over the d5 square, this pawn on d6 will become permanently weak and always a target of attack. And it can become a major weakness in the endgame. And not only is the pawn itself weak as a result, but the square in front of the pawn is also weak and is very useful for the enemy pieces. All right. And also, as a consequence, I like to mention, because of the weakness of this pawn, the bishop on e7 is also affected. All right, so there's a lot of collateral damage in black's position from having a backward pawn. So you might say, well, why would black take on a backward pawn? Well, the idea is not for it to be a permanent weakness, but just a temporary weakness whereby black takes it on temporarily, right, so that he could obtain a free position with his pieces, and then eventually he will push that pawn, and once he achieves that push, he will achieve full equality in the position. So again, just imagine if this pawn was pushed and gone, you can see there's nothing wrong with black's position whatsoever. So a major battle revolves around the ability of black to be able to organize that push and white's ability to stop it or create some type of weakness elsewhere. All right, so a lot of strategy going on. Castle. Knight G3. So again, we see the knight getting over to the queen side. And another thing I want to point out about this pawn being on E4, besides restricting the D5 advance, it also serves as an outpost. So at the right time, the knight may want to hop up to F5. In some cases, the knight will hop to D5. So these are all things that black has to consider. Bishop E6. So we can see with these two pieces right here, let's make it 3 with the queen, that black is fighting for the control over D5. Because once he controls that square, he can push this pawn and liberate his position. And also eliminate the white E pawn. Again, imagine this pawn being gone and this pawn being gone. And we could see white even being worse in the center. Knight D5, because black has too much firepower on the D5 square, and there's no way for white to stop the push but by putting the knight in there. And this is a good time to point out one of the downsides of having the bishop on D3. The bishop on D3 blocks the action of the queen on D1, which would normally be able to affect this square. Of course, white knew this going into this line. So after knight D5, the game will take on a different strategic flavor, because now after bishop takes D5, E takes D5, this pawn, although technically backwards, is not really weakness anymore. It's very hard to attack this pawn with the white D pawn in front of it. So now, now the strategics play shifts from this idea of controlling that square in front of the pawn and trying to gang up on the backward pawn to a battle of majorities. If you will, imagine the squares or the files A, B, C, and D representing the queen side, right? These 4 files. And now count the pawns over here, and we see there's 4. And for white, and for black there's 1, 2, 3. So we can see white has a 4-3 queen side majority. And on the other side of the board, counting from the E file to the H file, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. And black has a 4-3 king side pawn majority on that side of the board. So the strategy now for both sides is the advance of the pawn majorities. Alright, black will try to advance his on the king side. Get these pawns going and make something of his majority, and and white will do the same thing. Alright, with that said, let's point out some other strategic factors. One, white has the 2 bishops. Right now it's not so dangerous because of the closed nature of the position, but the bishops still have good scope. The bishop on C1 is pretty much almost developed. It's hard to put it in a better spot. Maybe E3. Put the dark square bishop on E3 where it controls all of these squares. This bishop on D3 is excellent because after the exchange, notice how this pawn was blocking this bishop. You see, so white gave up one theme for another. First, there was the attack against this pawn, right, in the control of the D5 square. White gives that up, but releases the bishop. Okay, so you can see the ideas, and now it makes sense for the bishop to be there. You see how it all comes together. Bishop takes D5. E takes D5. So it's like you can see in these positions a plan A and a plan B. And it's like, okay, we'll go with plan A. We'll attack the backward pawn. We'll take over the D5 square. We'll try to occupy it, use it as a outpost, etc., etc. If that doesn't work, we'll switch to plan B, where we'll trade off, allow trade on the d5 square, we'll have more space, which white does, right, by having his pawn on the 5th rank, and we'll have a nice diagonal for our d3 bishop. Now, when we look at the d3 bishop and we see this queen looking beautiful also on the d1 to h5 diagonal, now this knight is looking pretty good over here on the king side, because now we can see some real attacking possibilities here. Because now this knight can be used, the knight on g3 can be used to get rid of, say, this knight right here on f6. You know, just for example, you know, eventually down the line, the move like knight h5, because this knight is holding the white pieces back from an all-out assault on the king side. Just imagine if this black knight wasn't here on f6. Queen move like queen h5 would be available, right? Knight h5, right? Just storming the king side. So we can see how this plan worked out and how the knight on b3 wouldn't be as useful as it is over here on g3. So this, my friends, is the idea behind the move we discussed earlier in 6 bishop d3. Alright, so now g6. So we see Vachier LaGrave is feeling the heat a little bit and making some preparation to keep, again, move like that from occurring and trading off this knight. Okay, but it comes with the price. He weakens his king side somewhat, right, to blunt the bishop and to keep, you know, pieces from getting on those light squares. All right. Now, this is not just a pure defensive move. I wouldn't be giving you the whole truth if I said that. Remember what I said after the exchange took place on d5 is that both sides' strategy is to push their majorities. So this move g6 fits right in. Eventually, this knight will have to move somewhere so that this f5 pawn can be pushed. Right? But he couldn't move the knight first, because again, he will allow pieces to invade on the light square. So he had to prepare that with g6. c4. Okay? Don't really need explanation for that. Again, the majorities are being mobilized. White wants to play b4 and be able to eventually move this pawn and basically just create a passed pawn on the queen side. There it goes, knight e8. Now, again, with this back here, if he does knight e8, it's difficult because the queen can invade. So he made these preparations. Knight e8 now prepares this move. Bishop h6. Okay, real obvious attacking move. Knight comes to g7. Defensive move and offensive move at the same time. There it goes. b4. Knight d7. Rook c1. What's the idea? Just reinforcing the push. Notice how this bishop and knight and pawn all like trying to guard this square. a5. Okay, only a true newbie will make a move like this and just weaken their square like that. a3. He wants to keep black out of that square. A takes b4. A takes b4. Now he creates Vachier LaGrave I'm talking about. He opens the file for his rook. But he helps white out on the queen side by playing over there against this majority. Usually you don't want to play on your opponent's side, on the side of the board where your opponent is strong. So here he makes this concession where he gives Nakamura, helps Nakamura achieve what he's trying to do, which is achieve a pass pawn eventually by pushing a5 and trading off. But he has a developed rook without actually having to move the rook. So again, chess is a game of give and take. So it all boils down to how you evaluate the position. If you correctly evaluate the position, then you can, make those kind of moves. But it's risky. The Sicilian is a risky opening. Rook a3. So we see the penetration of the rook into the position here. Nakamura plays knight to e4. Again, trying to get this pushing. There's f5. Of course, Nakamura anticipated this move. So he plays knight c3, e4, and bishop e2. Now, what's interesting to me about this position is black. Of course, it's easier for black to mobilize his majority, but he has to be careful not to allow his majority to be crippled. So even though it's he's moving the pawns now, he has to be careful not to allow his pawns to be hampered by white, because what happens is once they become bogged down, so to speak, then they become targets, and then you can attack fixed targets. Bishop g5. So this bishop has been suspect the whole game, like blocked and pretty bad the whole game. So it's natural for Maxime-Vachier to want to trade it off. Bishop takes g5, queen takes g5, and of course this looks good for black because he has these pawns well advanced, and he's looking to create a kingside attack. Right, there's a lot of ideas here in the position. All right, so black is, and what's interesting about this game is that, and in these positions in general, is that when black's pushing his majority on the king side, it's with the idea of attack in the king and checkmate, of course. Black is pushing the queen side majority with the idea of creating, promoting a queen. Okay, so black's push on the king side is definitely much more dangerous because, of course, you can allow your opponent to get a queen because you can checkmate him. So black's attack is much more dangerous than that of white's. So Nakamura has to be very careful. c5. So he gets this pushing. All right. Here's some tactics right here. All right. So knight e5 is played by Vachier LaGrave. Again, he's going for the attack here. Right. This knight, very strong. But I must show you, this idea right here. So say D takes c5, B takes c5, and knight takes c5 would be a mistake after knight b3 with the attack from the knight on the rook and the attack from the rook on c1, this discovered attack. And then the only alternative for black then would be to give up the exchange here. Bishop takes d3, knight takes d3, and rook c7. And this knight is very strong, but it's not enough compensation and not to justify the sacrifice of the exchange. And I prefer white's position here, especially at the move like for instance f4 and knight d6, queen takes, and then queen a1. Very sharp position though. Of course, knight e6 here to stop the mate threat. So we could see black has these pawns rolling down. Great knight on d3, and white, if he can hold on, has this material advantage and does have an exposed diagonal and a rook hanging out on the 7th rank. So it's very double-edged position. So he doesn't take this pawn here. He plays knight e5. Another alternative was knight h5, with the idea of coming here. And let's say after bishop takes h5, g takes h5, opening up the g file. Nakamura can then push this pawn majority, c6, knight e7, and c takes b7. And this gets crazy. Unfortunately for black, this looks good, but after king h1, it's hard to see, you know, what black's continuation can be here. See, after c takes b7, and let's see, knight takes e4, f takes e4, rook to c7, rook a6, queen c2, rook b6, and black stands worse still. I mean, there's a lot of tricks in the position. That's why I was kind of just trying to double check. There's a lot of like tricks in the position, but it's still with correct play, black is standing worse here. Some players will like positions like that, where even though they might be worse, they have like dynamic chances here. This is one of those kind of positions where white is like statically better, but you can see that black's position looks kind of menacing. So after c5 by Nakamura, knight e5, c6. Again, if b takes c6, d takes c6, and knight takes c6, again, you have the same idea, knight b5 here, with the attack on the rook and the knight. So Vachier LaGrave plays knight h5. There it is. And now the g file comes open. So this position statically is, and when I say statically, I'm just talking about just the, if I take a snapshot of the position and look at the pawn structure, this is a bad ending for black here. So black basically in this position must win by checkmate, right? Or he must create some type of tactical assault that will cause white to give up massive amounts of material, because he's not going to win this, if the queens or rooks are traded off. So Vachier LaGrave must play for attack, which he does. So king h1, getting a natural move, just getting off the g file. Nakamura knows what's happened. I'm sure he's conducted many attacks like this himself. So king h1 and queen to h4. Of course, bring the knight here and threaten the checkmate there on h2, and also the forking possibility on f2. Queen to d4. Notice how the queen on d4 along with the rook protects against this. So now he just has to deal with the raw threat of checkmate on h2. And he meets that with h3. And f4 is played. Of course, there's a pin, so the knight is not really in danger, so he pushes the pawn, right? But notice that even though we have these attacking themes going on, notice the general play, right, was that of pushing the pawn majorities. You see black doing it on the king side, and we see white doing it on the queen side. So yes, the pieces are being involved as they should be, but notice what the pawns are doing, right? That's what you need to remember in a strategy like that. Of course, you have to maneuver the pieces around, but the general strategy with the pawns in that position, once that exchange takes place on d5, mobilize majorities. f4, now king g1. Now there's now there's a threat to take the knight on g4. Vachier LaGrave decides it's time to sacrifice because, again, like I said, he's not gonna win the end game here. So he just goes he just goes for it. e3 is played. Nakamura is a great calculator himself, and he says, hey, why not take the pawn here? H takes g4. H takes g4. And c takes b7. Okay, so here it is. The culmination, the moment of truth. Vachier LaGrave, of course, is looking for some type of mate on the dark squares. So he plays e takes f2. Rook takes f2. And g3. Simply rook takes f4 by Nakamura. Queen h2 by Vachier LaGrave. King f1. And Vachier LaGrave is forced to resign. There is no further continuation that can help black. For example, excuse me. For example, if queen to h1, then simply king e2. And let's just throw this in there. Queen takes g2, king d3, queen f3, of course, for giggles. But there is no other legitimate continuation after that. So that's why he gave up. But that was an exciting game, and a good example of some of the strategic motifs from both sides. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you guys like and subscribe, and your comments are welcome. And if you think I missed something, or if I did miss something, feel free to post it in the comments below. I always try to respond, and I hope you enjoy this lesson. I'll see you guys on the next video.